The M4 Sherman was one of the tanks of World War II, serving as the American workhorse for pretty much the entirety of America's involvement. It holds a unique distinction as being one of very few vehicles to have served in every theater of operations under many different flags. Further, it became an excellent platform from which to develop specialized AFVs, equipping everything from flamethrowers to howitzers to bridges and bulldozers and mine-clearing flails and rockets, and you get the point.
Did you make some of those up?
Part, if not most of its success, was owed to the fact that the Sherman was so adaptable and modular, allowing parts from one variant to easily fit onto another. This greatly simplifies things from a materiel and maintenance perspective, but really makes it difficult to identify variants from photos. At this point, I'd like to thank the Sherman tank site and the Sherman minutia site, as both were indispensable in my research. The Sherman tank site has dozens of articles covering everything from turret modules and gun mounts to various representations of Sherman tanks in film. The Sherman minutia site is incredibly in-depth to say the least. Going into this project, I had no idea how many different iterations of the Sherman tank there were. The minutia site breaks down everything from pistol ports to lifting ring shapes to track types to subtle production differences between manufacturers like Pressed Steel Car and Baldwin Locomotive. If you take a dive into the minutia site, prepare to give up a few days of your life. Anywho, the kit on the bench today is Tamiya's M4A3, kit number 35250. This particular kit is a 2002 revamp of their 1981 M4A3, and it has not aged a day. The hull in my example is dated 1987 and has all the crisp detail and sharp edges of a tub manufactured a year ago. This release provides a large number of alternate parts, allowing you to build almost every iteration of A3 Sherman. I'll try to break it down as we go, so let's get to it. The hull is molded bathtub style with only the differential cover and rear plate needing to be installed. The differential cover is of the one-piece sharp nose variety. The bolt strip is patterned after the later iterations, with the bolts being counterbored below the surface of the hull to protect the bolt heads from being sheared off or otherwise damaged beyond use from enemy fire. The entire assembly has almost no texture, which the more studious of you could rectify with some putty or dissolved plastic. The fit on the final drives are a little weird. Although the kit provides options, neither will fill the gaps entirely. The rear plate is simple and correct for A3 Shermans, with the engine access door in the center flanked by the exhaust pipes. Just above and behind is the exhaust deflector. Although the deflector could be in two positions, Tamiya has molded it so it can only be in the down position. These blocks on the fenders are racks for extra track links, and they hold 3 each. The crew hatches are molded in the large hatch style, which I'm sure the crew appreciates. The fit here could be better, and it leaves a pretty big gap on the outside edges when closed. Between them is the hull ventilator with a sheet metal protector over its top, a feature mostly seen on late war vehicles. All the necessary mounts for headlights and sirens are present, with deep indexing marks for correct placement. On the port side, behind the driver's hatch, we can see the manufacturing and part numbers for the hull. This C within an octagon is the trademark of American Steel, specifically their cast armor plant in East Chicago. E8020 is the part number for the hull created by the engineers. B2403 is the serial number for the part given by the manufacturer. Oddly, the differential cover lacks any such markings. Scattered about the hull are the ventilators, armored fill-up caps, and the grille covering the engine. The A3's power plant is the Ford GAA, a V8 engine capable of 500 horsepower at 2,600 RPM. The biggest differentiator between all Sherman variants is the engine, with the A2 and A3 essentially being the same tank, just the A2 being powered by a diesel engine and the A3 being gasoline powered. The kit also includes a series of appliqué armor pieces which were installed by the factories on Shermans that lacked wet stowage. Nevertheless, the crews understandably wanted as much steel between them and the enemy as possible, so it's not out of the question for it to be a field add-on. The edges of the armor plates have excellent weld texture that some dry brushing and a wash should emphasize wonderfully. The turret appears to be the high bustle version. With the introduction of large hatches, the rear of the turret needed to be lifted a few inches in order to clear the extra height up front. The top of the turret is adorned with similar witness marks to the hull. The familiar C within an octagon again indicating American Steel's cast armor plant in East Chicago. The casting texture over the whole piece is less subtle than the differential cover, but not overdone. On the port side is a curious hole one could almost overlook. This is the muzzle for the 2-inch smoke mortar. Early implementations of the mortar were flush with the surface, as presented by Tamiya, but later versions changed it to a projection from the turret. Some turrets dispensed with the mortar entirely and welded a patch into the hull. This can easily be accomplished by filling it with putty. The mantlet included is for the M4A3, the latest version of the M34 gun mount for the 75mm M3 gun. While possible to modify the mantlet into one of the other iterations of M34, it would require more work than I am willing to put in. On the port side is a hull board for the muzzle of the coaxially mounted 30 caliber Browning M1919 machine gun, and on the starboard side is a hull board for the main sight. Just inboard of the smoke mortar is the loader's periscope. A little further inboard is the spotlight, and dead center in the roof is the turret ventilator, a small fan mounted in the roof to expel fumes. The last feature in the front of the turret is the gunner's Unity periscope. This periscope is mounted to be coaxial to the main gun, and as such is the only one in the tank that does not move. It is also the only periscope modeled in the extended position. Features that dominate the roof are of course the two hatches. The starboard side hatch is the commander's cupola, and Tamiya had provided two versions. The more common split hatch and the late war vision cupola. The vision cupola had 6 vision blocks built into the rotatable rim, giving the commander a less limited view of the outside world while staying within the safety of the tank. As one could guess, this feature was quite popular among crewmen, so they were retrofitted on older tanks as soon as parts became available. In this release, Tamiya modeled the vision blocks and ring as a solid piece, while more recently they've switched to a clear glass as on this EZ8. The port side hatch is for the loader. This feature was notably absent on Shermans until the A3 for some reason. On the loader's left side is the pistol port, a feature that was left off of vehicles starting in April 1943 but returned after much protest in July of that year. Continuing rearward, we have the mount for the whip antenna. Adjacent is the mount for the 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun. Ostensibly an anti-aircraft mount, I can't imagine it was entirely useful against anything other than infantry and unarmored targets. Fans of the 2014 movie Fury will remember that the eponymous tank had an extra 30 caliber mounted on the roof for the commander's use. While this certainly happened, I can only find a single image of a Sherman with this configuration. Moving on, here we have the bustle. The seam between the two halves is pretty gruesome, but it doesn't need to be touched up very much to be accurate. Mounted on the bustle are the racks for stowing the 50 cal or whatever various goods the crew wants to stow, as Shermans were notorious for having gear all over them. Moving to the starboard side, we can talk about the cheek. I mentioned appliqué armor earlier, and you might have noticed the odd bulge on the sides of some turrets. In order to fit the powered traverse mechanism inside the turret, a sizable amount of material was ground out of the side. The quick fix was to simply weld an extra piece of sheet steel over the cheek, but Tamiya has not provided this option. The permanent fix was a change to the turret molds where the relevant cheek was cast much thicker, but whether it's crews adding more armor or not getting the memo about the change, cheek armor can be seen all the way to the end of the war. The entire undercarriage is more or less inherited from the preceding American tanks, M2 and M3. The tracks here are big rubber chevrons, probably T-48s, without grousers. The tracks are pulled forward by the 13-tooth drive sprocket before rolling under the road wheels. The road wheels are 6 per side with large rubber tires. They are grouped in pairs on vertical volute spring suspension bogies, only slightly changed from their predecessors. From there, they wrap around the idler wheel before sliding over the track guides and back to the drive sprocket. The drive sprocket is provided in 2 flavors. One simply cut from flat sheet, and another that is most likely a forged sprocket from Chrysler. If you're aiming to be as accurate as you can, the less complex sprocket is the more common, but not by a wide margin. Tamiya has also given options for the road wheels: stamped disc-shaped wheels and stamped 6-spoke wheels. Between the two, the 6-spoked wheels are more common, with the flatter wheels not showing up until the fall of 1944. The cast number in the middle can't be traced to any particular manufacturer like the hull can, but it still provides a drawing number from the manufacturer. One thing that is notably absent to my eye is the lack of any cast texture to the bogies. With the exception of the stamped wheels and return guide, all of these parts would have been cast. Now that the tank is together, we can move on to painting. I prime it with my favorite Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch Gray. I'm careful to apply very little because it's very easy for a spray can to deliver a lot of paint in a very small amount of time. Once dry, I load up Tamiya XF2 flat white and start to add highlights to the model. You'll notice I'm spraying random patterns without really building up a lot of paint in one spot. I do this as a form of color modulation to break up the uniformity of the top coat. Not only does this add scale to the model, but it adds some visual interest as well. Then, using XF1 flat black, I spray a shadow coat over the underside of the module as well as the areas that would be in shadow. Everybody has their favorite flavor of olive drab, and there's not really a right paint to choose for it. I have a half dozen olive drabs in my paint collection, but I find Tamiya to be the easiest to airbrush, so I load up XF62. Tamiya have provided 3 different marking schemes for this tank. I've gone with the second option because it's the most generic of the 3, giving me more freedom in what I can do. With the markings selected, I spray gloss clear on the areas to provide a decent undercoat. Although it doesn't call for the roundel to be used, I love this marking, so I use it anyway. The unit markings on the front and rear indicate that this is the 50th vehicle of Charlie Company, 69th Armored Regiment of the 6th Armored Division. The 6th Armored landed in Europe shortly after D-Day and spent the next 5 months in northwest France before being relieved and sent to establish a defensive position near the German city of Saarbrücken in early December. The division would later participate in the Battle of the Bulge, but I'm choosing to depict a vehicle during autumn of 1944. The only issue I ran into is that the markings on the left side started to disintegrate a bit around the edges. Later on when I do the weathering, I'll try to work this in. I use a small amount of Walther's Solvaset to make sure the decal settles into the flame cut marks. Once it's all dry, I spray matte clear over the entire vehicle. Moving on to the tracks, I give them a base coat of Vallejo track primer. I find it works great as a base coat because it's not too dark, not too light, and just the right shade of brown. I also dust a very light layer across the bottom of the vehicle. For dirt buildup on the tracks, I grind up some oil-based chalk pastels and use mineral spirits as a fixer. My process is admittedly very haphazard, but I find it works for me. Once it all dries, I brush off the excess and clean up the mess I've made. The engine deck is where larger and hardier tools are kept. Pioneer tools like shovels and pickaxes had wooden handles, so I mix up a warm wood tone. Modern tools tend to have hickory handles purely for practical reasons like shock resistance, so I expect wartime tools would have been the same. With all the tiny bits and bobs done, you could call it done if you wanted to. However, Tamiya had provided us with a plethora of little goodies to stow all around the tank. 8 ammo cans for caliber 50, 8 cans for the caliber 30, 2 jerry cans, 4 K-ration crates, a spare bogey wheel, 2 unknown crates, and 2 unknown cans. In addition, we've been provided a few lengths of spare track. Interestingly, the lengths are 2 different track types, with the longer being all steel T54E1s and the shorter being more of the rubber T48s on the vehicle. Similarly, the spare bogey wheel is the 5-spoked wheel commonly seen earlier in the war, while the bogies provided for constructing the vehicle being more common as the years went on. Everything except for the crates and tracks are made from punched and welded steel, painted whatever shade of olive drab. The cans for the caliber 50 opened along the long edge and held 105 rounds. The 30s open along the short edge and hold 250 rounds each. Jerry cans are a fascinating bit of engineering and logistics in their own right, but I won't get too far into that. Each can holds 20 liters, just over 5 US gallons, of whatever liquid you want to throw in there. Typically, gas cans have a G stamped into them as depicted here. I paint one red just to break up the massive green. I make a few tarps or shelter halves from scraps of aluminum foil. I shape them with a soft brush, then carefully prime and paint them before cementing them with white glue. I use a few different tones of olive and khaki to make the vehicle less monotonous. In addition to looking more lived in, I can use the tarps to cover a few mistakes. Once I've got it all where I want it, I spray another light coat of Tamiya Matte Clear. This would be the 3rd layer of clear coat, so I'm very frugal this time, hitting only the new stowage and a few areas that I missed on the last run. Once dry, I grab a graphite pencil and pick out some corners and high spots to make it look like metal. I'm pretty satisfied with the look, so now it's time to make it filthy. I'll be using oils and mineral spirits to weather the tank, so I remove the tracks as not to reactivate or remove anything I don't want to. To start with, I grab some tiny brushes for rain streaks. Using primarily white and a few grimier tones, I apply small dots to the upper edge and then quickly pull them down with a dry brush. Earlier, I painted some rust tones in the area where the decal disintegrated, so I add a few rust tones and streak those as well. To add some depth and scale, I'll be adding a dark pin wash to the entire vehicle. I prefer not to use straight up black because it rarely occurs in nature. Instead, I mix up a very dark approximation of the top coat and apply it to creases and corners where shadows would naturally find themselves. Before I slap the tracks back on, I grab some dirt tones and slather them on the running gear. As you can see, this highlights the prime reason people don't like to use rubber band tracks. They don't tend to sag like real steel tracks or even workable plastic tracks do. I very gingerly slide a bamboo skewer in between the track and the hull and then glue it down with some white glue. Tamiya is rightly one of the biggest names in model making, and this kit shows off their excellence in spades. With a deluge of spare parts, wonderfully sculpted figures, and options galore, any World War II armor modeler should happily add this rendition to their collection. Really, the only fault I can point to here is the lack of any sponsons, which is seemingly a trademark of earlier Tamiya kits. Even that is something that can easily be fixed with a few scraps of plastic card. Now, as far as things on my end go, there are a few seams I could have paid more attention to, and I could have done with fewer clear coats. When it finally came time to do the oil work, the tank already had 3 coats in some places, so I was afraid of adding a gloss clear for the oils and another matte layer on top of that. Instead, I just applied my washes over the matte clear coat that was already there, effectively staining a lot of areas like a filter rather than a wash. And lastly, my technique of using oil-based pigments for dirt buildup is going to be re-evaluated, as the attempted buildup on the bogies practically became a very grainy oil paint. All that being said, this was an absolute pleasure to build, and I learned a few things that will help me in the future. Now, if you'll excuse me, I gotta go find somewhere to put all these spare parts. Gonna be good? No? Okay. Alright, so this is the end of the video on the Tamiya M4A3 Sherman. I thank you for sticking around this long to watch it. I know it got a little heavy on the historical detail there. Are you still biting me? So, interesting note here, this is chronologically the first model that I started, but I wasn't able to get it finished until this point because this little guy ate some of my parts. I think he ate specifically the idlers and yeah, one of the drive sprockets and one of the idlers, and I had to get replacement parts from Tamiya, which thank you to Tamiya for getting those to me very quick. It was during the holiday season, and I'm sure it was frustrating getting those to me. I wanted to do this as more or less an out-of-the-box build, even with the inclusion of the tarps, I guess. So I didn't do a whole lot of modifications, like filling in the sponsons, or really filling in the sponsons. But this is an absolute dream of a kit. If you've been in the hobby for any amount of time, you know how excellent Tamiya is, and this is no different. This is a fabulous kit. It would make an excellent platform for aftermarket parts like details, interior details, or stowage on the back. This is an absolutely fabulous kit. There were a lot of spare parts. Actually, you know what? Hold on. Now, some of them I have duplicates of because I ordered a replacement sprue. So if I want to customize a future Sherman, I have Chrysler drive sprockets, I have final drives, I've got return rollers, as I said. I didn't even touch on the infantry. Those will be coming in a future video. They look excellent. Figure painting is not my strong suit, so we'll see how it goes. Also didn't get a chance to touch on the decals that were included for the K-ration crates and 50 cal ammo cans. They are legible if you have... Yeah, they are legible if you have like a telescope lens or something. So if you've stuck around this long, thank you very much for watching. Hit subscribe if you want. Follow me on Twitter. You can do that here. Yeah, I've got a couple videos in the works, and I've got a really big one coming in a few months that I'm really excited for. Stick around. Thanks. Bye.